Hey everyone, welcome to Logan Pig. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round bookworms, because the time has come for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we will continue our journey through the book My Effin Life by Geddy Lee. We're on chapter 18. Without further ado, let's find out what happens next. In the early months of 1983, Alex, Neil, and I reviewed the experience we'd had making signals and concluded that the direction of the band hung in the balance. We needed a change. As much as we loved Terry and appreciated beyond words what he'd helped us accomplish, we felt that we had to break old habits, learn new techniques, and generally challenge ourselves to work in new ways, which could happen only with a producer from a different background and a fresh viewpoint. We asked him to fly down to Florida. We climbed aboard our bus with him, pulled out onto the highway, and after the usual goofing around, engaged in a painfully difficult exchange. How else could it have been? Brune had nurtured our sound since 1974, watching us grow from the naive and hungry players we used to be to the accomplished band we were now. How exactly do you tell the only real producer you've ever worked with that you want to change? But as we began to talk, it was apparent that Terry, too, had misgivings. He didn't want to stop working with us, but nor was he sold on the direction we were moving in. He was particularly concerned that the electronic drums and keyboards we were so enamored with diminished the role of the guitar to our detriment. He wasn't wrong, but this was the direction we'd committed to, and there really was no turning back. The longer we talked, the clearer it became that, despite his having given everything he had to us, we needed someone new in the producer's chair. So sadly, but amiably, we parted ways. We took no joy in saying goodbye. It was a scary feeling to suddenly be without our mentor. You could even have called him a father figure, but it was also exhilarating to consider the possibilities the future held. In reality, with Terry always having our backs, we had kind of lived a sheltered life. We were soon to find out just how sheltered it had been. We kicked into producer search mode. Ideally, we wanted someone working in the current London music scene, the hub of some of the most exciting music and musical technology of the moment. A 4-night run we had just sold out at Wembley Arena would give us different nights to meet different guys, among them Trevor Horn, who had been a member of Yes and the Buggles before racking up an impressive list of producer credits: ABC, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Propaganda, Malcolm McLaren, Grace Jones, and more. After the first show, he asked us, "Have you talked to other musicians about what I'm like to work with? You might want to do that before you choose me." The inference, obviously, was that he wasn't the easiest chap to deal with in a studio, and indeed, to illustrate that, producer Peter Collins would years later tell me a story about working at one of Trevor's studios. On a coffee break, Peter had told him he was having a hard time coaxing a good performance from a certain singer. Horn responded, "Have you tried shouting at him?" Over the following nights we met Hugh Padgham, who had made several records with the Police, Michael Kamen, whom we respected as an arranger. He'd arranged the strings on Nobody's Hero 10 years later, and finally, Steve Lillywhite. We loved his work, with bands as wide-ranging as the Psychedelic Furs, Johnny Thunder's Heartbreakers, XTC, and U2, and especially Big Country, with their bagpipe mimicking twin guitars, with a mind to soothing Alex's fears of being overwhelmed by keyboards. Lillywhite seemed genuinely interested in working with us, so keen that he came to our gig in Birmingham to acquire more insight into our sound, the way we worked, and what we were like as people. I thought we got on very well, and soon we were making plans because we thought we had a deal. After the tour, we went home for a break, but couldn't wait to get started writing. We were totally fired up and thought, wow, that was way easier than we expected. Yeah, right. Less than 2 weeks before the start of the writing sessions, word came in from Ray that Mr. Lillywhite was pulling out. We heard excuses about the project not being right for him or some such bull. When in reality, it seems he had been offered a chance to record with Simple Minds and was simply blowing us off. Now, there's an expression, I believe, about a man's word being his bond. This man's word, apparently, was meaningless. Okay, good to know. No big deal, Steve. It shouldn't be hard to find a producer in just 2 weeks. Thanks for letting us know. All the best, mate, and you too. Wise in the knowledge that producers can be full of. We got back to writing unsettled, to say the least. It wasn't the best way to embark on a new record, but, us being us, we had a few laughs at what's-its-name's expense, and even as more prospective producers flew in for meetings, we got to work, doing our best to strike a balance between Alex's raging guitar and my latest keyboard sounds, and before long, we had Distant Early Warning, Red Sector A, and Between the Wheels. We suspected, of course, that the best producers would likely be booked months in advance, so I cannot emphasize enough how stressed we still were. Every producer we liked and who wanted the gig had scheduling issues. Studio time we had booked was looming as well, as a 5-night warm-up stint at Radio City Music Hall in New York. It was no cinch turning the ocean liner RMS Rush around. Obsessively preoccupied, I brought the work home with me, talking on the phone most of the weekends to management about producers and engineers, reviewing CVs, and listening to records and demos. The search hogged all the space in my brain, making me, shall we say, a less than ideal father and husband. I alienated myself from my own family. Nancy had opened a salon with Karen in a second-story walk-up at the corner of Yorkville and Young. It was a super exciting time for her, but while in my mind I thought I was being supportive, my obsession with finding a producer stopped me from being as happy for her as I should have been. Neither of us acknowledged the crack opening up between us, one that would yawn ever wider and push us into very separate worlds of our own making. Oblivious to her being drawn into a new circle of friends and fashionistas, I assumed she would and could handle everything while taking care of Jules, running the household, and supporting me, just as she always had. Actually, she did handle it, but my physical and mental absences made it harder than it should have been, and her resentment was festering as her independence was growing. The one constant that held us together was our love for Jules. Among the legions of producers and engineers who had come and gone from our rehearsal space in a closed-up ski resort north of the city was an Englishman named Peter Henderson, whose engineering and co-production credits impressed us. Supertramp's Breakfast in America, Jeff Beck's Wired, Zappa's Shake Your Booty, and Paul McCartney's Wings of the Speed of Sound were just a few of the albums he had worked on and sounded terrific to us. Peter came out of George Martin's Air Studios and had been trained by the Beatles' longtime engineer, Geoff Emerick. He was a real English public school type, amiable, smart, sporty, and good for a laugh. But most important, he knew his stuff and loved music passionately. He was articulate and refreshingly honest with us about aspects of our songs he liked and didn't. He seemed to genuinely dig the direction our new songs were taking, and it was with a great sigh of relief that we hired him. The search for producers had been stressful, but I believe that talking to all those talented gentlemen about their past work, techniques, and attitudes taught me more about making records than any hands-on recording experience I'd had to date. True enough, but as we buckled down to record Grace Under Pressure, my optimism would prove short-lived. I liked Peter personally and respected his skills a lot. He really understood what good sound was and how to achieve it. In fact, he may have been the most talented pure engineer I've ever worked with. But when it came to producing us at least, something was missing. I know our expectations were high, maybe unreasonably so, but after all we'd gone through to break away from Brune, we had something to prove to ourselves. High expectations were warranted, and shouldn't they damn well always be? If memory serves, the first song we had a go at recording was Distant Early Warning. With a virtual stranger staring at us from behind the glass, we were both psyched up and a little nervous during the first take, but settled in after a couple run-throughs. Then waited with bated breath for his response, but all we got was quiet hesitation. "Well," I asked, "how was that?" Yeah, he said. "Sounding good, but do you want to try another couple?" Okay, a normal enough response. So we did a couple more, and afterwards, again, hesitation. How was that one, Peter?" "Yeah, good. Do you want to come in and listen?" We were all smiles when we heard the sounds. Fat, deep, tough, evocative, very encouraging. Then I noticed that some of the VU meters had been taped over. I asked him why, and he said something about preferring to judge with his ears than be too hung up on mechanical readings. Wow, I thought, that's confidence. I like that a lot. Plus, he was nailing the sounds, and the performances seemed good. And yet, it was always, how about another couple takes? It was the template for the entire Peter Henderson experience. We'd do more takes, and more, but never did we hear the words that Brune used to utter. "Guys, I think we got it." It was like wringing water from a stone. It was becoming apparent that, as intelligent as his analysis of our music was, he didn't have it in him to be decider-in-chief. For weeks, it was the same at every stage of recording and overdubbing, and when we'd finally gotten to the mixing stage, it got even worse. We'd do a basic mix of a song, then innumerable versions of the same mix with 1 or 2 decibel changes, like "final with guitar louder" or "final with guitar lower." Now, you always do a few alternate mixes for TV or car radios, or keep a vocal up or vocal down, mix in the can, in case a week later you realize with fresh ears that the balance was wrong. But we had never done so many before. It's nice to have an option or two, but this was nuts, especially for a guy like me who already has option anxiety. We'd spend as many as 14 hours a day in the studio mixing and listening, deciding which takes would actually make it to the album took forever. We kept our feelings to ourselves in a mustn't grumble attitude, but quietly, it was wearing us to the bone. That long, cold winter took a chunk out of us as a band and me as an individual. I'd invested so much of myself to find the perfect producer, then push so hard for decisions during those frustrating sessions that I ignored all the signs of my dereliction of duty to my wife and son. And after the sessions, it still wasn't over for me, as I had to take the tapes to my old friend and brilliant mastering engineer, Bob Ludwig, sift through the multitude of masters, and assemble the final version as it exists today. It stood up pretty well in his finely tuned room, though I was dissatisfied with the bottom end I was getting from my Steinberger bass guitar, and Bob had to work some magic to bring more of it out on a couple of the songs. At the end, my nerves were too frayed to be excited, but hey, what won't kill you makes you stronger, right? What idiot ever said that? The launch of MTV in 1981 had already revolutionized the music industry. Doing videos was now de rigueur, and every band, even ours, was urged to produce a breakthrough one. Budgets and production values were rising, at times exceeding some bands' recording budgets. Think about that for a moment. Record companies were willing to spend more money on the video than the record itself. That insane concept gives you an idea of the power MTV had back then. Because video so obviously aligned with my love of movies, I became the point man for most of Rush's visual projects, but I learned very quickly that making videos was not the same as making movies. To start with, Rush songs were never going to make the top 10, so the higher-ups funding these things, with our future royalty money I might add, had little motivation to advance us $250,000 for whatever extravaganza I had in my head. My big ideas were invariably rewarded with a reality sandwich. Well, we'd love to do this, but we don't have Steven Spielberg's budget. Still, we were intrigued by the possibilities because so many of the songs we wrote were ripe for visual exposition. Neil's lyrics were filled with arguments and ideas, protagonists and antagonists, fantastic vistas and epic stories. Ideal you can imagine for a plot line and an inventive director. The challenge was that we had always hated spelling out the meaning of a lyric, and it felt corny, trying to act out a literal-minded 5-minute screenplay in a low-budget way. Another challenge was that both management and record companies wanted us to appear in the videos, and we were not keen. Directors making a Rush video found themselves with a set of challenging preconditions, not least that we weren't exactly fashion icons or matinee idols. Neil refused to appear unless he was playing his drums for real, and we insisted that whatever story a director wanted to tell would have to somehow interpolate shots of the band without appearing intrusive or gratuitous. If you've ever wondered why cyborgs in a futuristic totalitarian dystopia have Rush on their all-seeing monitors, or that Neil doesn't appear at all, well, now you know. In future years, we'd turn away from stories in favor of a more high-concept or abstract approach, like the guy strapped to a pole and Stick It Out off Counterparts, where the intermittent appearance of the band didn't seem so jarring. So, we made them all right, as artfully we hoped as anything else we did. But it was compromise after compromise, and my ardor soon dissipated. In any case, as time went on, they became less important as a marketing tool, and we pretty much stopped doing them altogether, switching our attention to films for our live shows, where we could take our inside jokes and comic ideas and throw them up on the screen, sharing our goofy sense of humor with a dedicated audience and without the approval of record companies, TV channels, or anyone else. Grace Under Pressure was well received, and After Image, Distant Early Warning, The Body Electric, and The Enemy Within got a surprising amount of video play on MTV and its Canadian equivalent, Much Music. Were we darlings of the small screen? Well, Alex's Simon Le Bon coiffure notwithstanding, there would be no top 10 buzz clips for us, but it was good exposure. From May through November 1984, we toured the album across Canada and the US, this time around playing only 77 shows in 6 months. We had told Ray that the era of 23 days in a row without a single one off were over. We were playing longer sets now, which took a greater toll on us, and our new rule was 3 gigs in a row, max. Neil brought along a bicycle and spent off days pedaling long rides to clear his head of rock and roll routines. One time he rode the more than 90 miles from Milwaukee to Chicago. Some nice light exercise after playing a 2.5-hour show the night before. Seriously, the man was a monster, both on the kit and his two-wheeler. As you probably know from books he'd later write, like The Masked Rider, his love of bicycles led to a passion for motorbikes. He was a road guy through and through, but what he really dug was the lifestyle outside of the band, where he could travel in relative anonymity. My version of heaven, meanwhile, was flying. For most of the tour, we still rode the bus, but for transatlantic flights since a farewell to Kings, we had been taking the Concorde. Now that was a amazing machine, flying just shy of Mach 2, so high that when you looked out, the clouds below had disappeared and the sky was black, like in outer space. To get from New York to London in just over 3 hours was like having a long meal in a cramped but gourmet restaurant, and the best part was that when you arrived, it was early in the morning, with time for a nightcap and bed at an almost respectable time without being jet-lagged. We had also started treating ourselves at the very end of North American tours by chartering a small plane to get us home quicker. It was during the last gig of that leg of the Grace Under Pressure tour in Providence that Alex and I noticed Neil looking agitated behind his drum kit. We thought it was fatigue at first, and indeed he was exhausted, but this was different. He kept it together, but was evidently having an anxiety attack and pretty much running on fumes. We barely made it through the show before clambering aboard the Learjet we had hired. Drinks in hand, we sat in close quarters across from one another. Learjets were fast, but confined, until about 30 minutes into the flight, when Neil looked up at us and said with a moan, "I've just got to get off." We told the pilot to land ASAP, and fortunately, he was able to put us down at the Rochester airport in a matter of minutes, where Neil was met by a car and driven home across the border, leaving us shaken because we had never really clocked that he had a serious fear of flying. For years, he had hidden it pretty well by being funny about it, razzing us about the dangers of aviation, and once even making t-shirts with a picture of a bus with wings, emblazoned, "The bus won't fall out of the sky." Before a gig in Jacksonville, Florida in 1980, he had handed those around in the dressing room, not registering that we were in the hometown of Leonard Skinner, whose Convair CV240 ran out of fuel and crashed. Fortunately, one of our crew had the presence of mind to rush in and point out that terrible coincidence, and poor Neil put them away before anyone was offended. Anyway, after the Learjet incident, we were all shaken and worried, not least because we knew the next time we'd be seeing him would be at Pearson Airport for a flight to Tokyo. That would be his first and last trip to Japan, but not only because of his fear of flying. We had always been reluctant to go to Japan because we wanted to bring along our full North American show, and the time and cost of shipping all that gear was prohibitive. Japanese companies guaranteed they could replicate any band stage setup so accurately that you'd never know the difference, so most Western bands playing there never brought their own. But we were skeptical. Finally, though, we worked out a compromise, bringing just some of our gear and leasing the rest when we got there, and off we went to do a mere 4 shows in 4 Japanese cities: Nagoya, Fukuoka, Osaka, and concluding at the famous Budokan in Tokyo. I was excited but disoriented, so to speak, by both the massive jet lag and the utterly unfamiliar culture. For a start, I was quickly disavowed of the notion that Japanese eat sushi morning, noon, and night. Not so. It's expensive and rich and usually saved for special occasions, although that didn't stop Lurks one iota from tucking in as often as he could. I was knocked out by the mash of ultra-modern and traditional Japanese architecture. The way, for instance, you might see at the end of some alley between 2 skyscrapers an old Shinto shrine tended by a priest in yukata and elevated geta. Likewise with the fashions on the street, where you'd be just as likely to see women in classic kimono and obi as you would hip fashionistas or a multitude of identically uniformed students. It was also the first place I'd been where I needed a card with the hotel's address on it, in Japanese, to find my way back. You could have dropped me a block away, and I'd have been totally lost, as not only is Tokyo's layout incredibly confusing, but finding a passerby in 1984 who spoke English was next to impossible. The concerts were a cultural adjustment too, as you might imagine. First, you went on super early, around 6 p.m. Then once you'd started to play, you'd be looking out onto a sea of black hair bobbing up and down like puppets on a string in time with the music. Well, sort of in time. They seemed so oddly robotic that we found ourselves stifling laughter up on stage. But still, the crowd did seem to be enjoying the hell out of the show. We had a day off before the Osaka show, and our concert promoter, the legendary Mr. Udo, treated us to a day at a Shinto, or bathhouse. It felt odd disrobing and bathing while female attendants walked around us with complete disinterest. They led us to a row of massage tables separated by tall privacy screens, where a second set of women in white-skirted uniforms and short white rubber rain boots greeted us impersonally, motioning us to lie down and proceeding to wash our hair and scrub us from head to toe as we joked with one another through the screens. I felt like I was in a car wash, where I was the car. After they had dried our hair and poured us drinks in the lounge, we dressed and headed back to the hotel, almost literally glowing. After such a unique experience, we were all in a terrific mood and gathered in the bar to happily pound back a few more drinks until Neil left to use the men's room but failed to return. One of the crew looked for him in the lobby and called back to us, "Hey guys, Neil's having an argument." We ran out, and there he was, berating a squat, tough-looking man who was fighting with a woman. Neil had apparently been outraged to see him beating on her, while the front desk people and security nonchalantly went about their day. Now the man was shouting back at Neil in Japanese, fairly obviously telling him to mind his own business. They shoved each other, at which point Alex got into the guy's face too. And then the hotel staff started yelling at us, urging us to leave the lobby, and as far as we could gather, assuring us that this was solely a matter between husband and wife. We were so incensed that we continued yelling at him to stop, but our protestations only made it worse. As security pushed us into the elevator and the doors closed on us, we watched in horror as the thug punched the woman in the stomach and she fell to the ground. We went up to our room stunned, confused, and fuming. What in the just happened? It was like we had entered a completely different Japan, one of brutality and indifference. The next day, our translator explained that the man was heavily tattooed, which, especially in Osaka, meant he was a member of the Yakuza, and that no Japanese would dare confront him. Suddenly, I understood why there had been signs in the bathhouse declaring no tattoos, code, in fact, for no Yakuza. We still weren't ready to let it go, however. We tried to argue that it was barbaric, demanding to know why the hotel would do nothing about it, but it was all too confrontational for him, and we were met with silence. In that moment, I felt the full collision of West meets East. It's naive and typically North American to think that a foreigner could begin to understand, let alone challenge, such a complex and age-old society, especially in the midst of a first, short visit. But still, as far as we were concerned, there was no justification for what we had witnessed. It was an abhorrent and violent act, surely, by any standard. For us, at least, the bloom was off the rose. We were depressed, no one more than Neil, who was so disturbed that he vowed never to return to Japan, and never did. Well, that's the end of Chapter 18. Let me know what you thought of this chapter in the comments below. By the way, my uncle went to see Rush on Saturday, and according to him, they sounded great. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.